Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be discussing artificial intelligence today, which is, I know, kind of a new topic and a not so new topic, right? But I think given everything that's been going on in the last few weeks, it's worth another conversation, right? In terms of AI's role in society, AI impact on the diversity and inclusion efforts, and more importantly on inclusiveness writ large. And that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about today during this webinar. Uh, So we're going to be starting in just a couple of moments, but while we wait, because there's a lot of folks who are registered for this webinar, and I think we're probably at around a fifth have shown up so far. But while we wait for, sorry, about four-fifths, what am I saying? While we wait for the rest to show up, why don't we write in to that questions box uh, to see just kind of where folks are coming in from. You should all have kind of a little chat box there, uh, or sorry, a little questions box there that you should all be able to write into. It looks like we've got people coming in from a few different places, right? I see a couple are writing in that they're from the UK. We've got one person who is from Denver, somebody else from New York. So hello, it's the person from New York. I'm from New York too. And we've got a couple of others from Massachusetts, from France, a couple more from one more from the UK. So it's a pretty transatlantic group, I would say, so far, which kind of makes sense for the time zone that we're on. So welcome to all, someone from California, that's really early. Okay, so welcome to all of you to today's webinar on AI and its impact on diversity. And we're going to get started by doing a quick introduction here. So my name is Jorge Vargas. This is not the usual introduction slide that I show. This is the introduction slide that I actually asked artificial intelligence to create for me. And I kind of curated some of it because it wasn't really making any sense. But I asked it, who is Jorge Vargas, who works at RW3 CultureWizard? And eventually I got some good information, right? So what I got was that he's the chief revenue officer of RW3 CultureWizard. He's been in the tech startup industry for over 10 years. It's actually getting closer to 15 or 20 at this point. I've stopped counting. That was born in Peru, but I live in New York. It was unclear as to the date, so I did it a favor and added it in. And it also got that I have 8 children. Um, and it even threw up this nifty little photo of me from when I ran the New York City Marathon. So all good stuff, New York City Half Marathon. So all good stuff. Um, but there's one thing in here that's completely false. Anyone want to guess what it is? You can write into the questions box and just guess as to which one of these is false. Is it that I'm Chief Revenue Officer of RW3 CultureWizard, that I've been in the tech space for over 10 years, that I host this series of webinars, that I was born in Peru and live in New York, or that I have 8 children who are Jorge Jr., Angel Federico, Gregorio Roberto, Lourdes Filomena, Eduardo Mariano, Ramon Teodoro, Teresita Carolina, and Maria Luisa. So if anyone wondered as to why I couldn't remember my 8 children's names, it's probably because that's the fact that's incorrect. I do not have 8 children who I believe are Portuguese, or maybe not. I don't know from the names, I couldn't tell. But no, that's not me, right? And so what it did was it got a little bit confused and it threw up this fact, right? That I'm some guy who's apparently got a very, very busy life at home, right? With these 8 children. Um, and that's kind of where I wanted to start with, right? Because pretty much a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is knowing how to evaluate the information that comes from artificial intelligence and reminding ourselves to not be passive as we consume that information, right? Because I think one of the mistakes that people make is that they consume the information in a very passive way. They're not being very conscious of what it is that they're consuming. They're not paying a lot of attention to what it is that they're consuming, and that's really where we have to really focus on for today, right? But before we get into all that, now that we've done the quick introduction of who I am, we're just as a reminder, right? We are using the GoToWebinar platform. The GoToWebinar platform, of course, I think it's a different screenshot now. I think they upgraded their system a couple of months back. I just need to update the screenshot, but the concept's pretty much the same, right? You should all have a chat, a questions box there. You can use that to input any questions or any feedback that you may have, or answer any questions that I might ask. It does default to computer audio typically, so if that's the case, but you would rather use, you're having a hard time hearing me or anything like that, I do recommend using the phone audio. Usually it's better sound quality, so it's always just a safe recommendation. We are recording the session, so you will have that recording sent to you at the end of the session. Usually it takes about a day or two, but you will receive it from someone on my team. And of course, we do recommend you maximize the screen and all that good stuff, right? So that's some of the housekeeping bit out of the way, and just a little bit more housekeeping in terms of who we are, right? So CultureWizard, this we wrote, we didn't have AI write it, so I stand behind all of these statements. CultureWizard has been around for over 25 years, and we provide cross-cultural as well as global inclusion training for companies all over the world. Right? And we do that using our online platform. We do that using our instructor-led training. We have our CultureWizard mobile app and several other resources that we can bring into the conversation. And we focus, as I mentioned, right on cross-cultural as well as global inclusion training, but we also do leadership development. We also provide data analytics services, so we can give you a concept of what inclusiveness looks like within your own organization, right? And so there's quite a bit that we bring into the conversation through material. And if you are interested in access to the CultureWizard platform for yourself or for your team, just simply shoot me a quick comment here on that questions box. I'll make note of it, and someone from my team or even myself will reach out at the end of the webinar and make sure that you have what you need. If you're a client of CultureWizard and I'm talking about stuff and you say, oh, we don't have content on this, I'm happy to provide that for you as well. Okay, so having said that, let's get into today's agenda. So we're going to start off, first of all, by defining artificial intelligence, right? What we're talking about, kind of getting past some biases that people may have about it. Then we're going to get into talking about how biases play a role in artificial technology. And I'm going to talk about both the outputs, but I'm also going to talk about the inputs, because there was recently an incident that was completely driven by the inputs that artificial intelligence received, and was kind of a big issue a couple of weeks ago now. And then, of course, we're going to talk about what you should bear in mind in order to promote inclusiveness within the organization. But we're going to start off, of course, by defining AI. And I always start off by doing this with this photo of the Terminator. It's actually really funny. Just yesterday, I should have mentioned, actually I did mention, right? I'm in New York. Just yesterday, there was a video that was going viral. Apparently, there was a robot walking around in Midtown Manhattan, and people were like taking pictures with it and touching it and all this stuff. So when I first started doing this webinar, the robot from Terminator was just kind of a joke. Now, apparently, we do have robots kind of walking around, but thankfully, none of them, as far as I know, are killer robots. But that's the myth, right, that many of us grew up with when it comes to smart computers and so forth, right? That we're going to have this kind of sentience sort of being. But really, let's talk about what artificial intelligence actually is. And I asked artificial intelligence to define itself, right? I thought let's just start there and kind of showcase a little bit of the strength of what it can do, right? And so whenever you see that little ChatGPT icon, that's because I just went in and pulled up a definition and used it for this presentation. Now, artificial intelligence, right? ChatGPT at least defines it as the emulation of human intelligence in machines, enabling them to learn, think, and solve problems. It encompasses various technologies like machine learning and is applied in industries such as healthcare, finance, and transportation. The key here is this concept of emulation, right? This concept that it is not actually human intelligence. It's not intelligence itself. It's an emulation of it, right? And I think what a lot of folks need to bear in mind when it comes to artificial intelligence, as we talk about it today, is that it's really a massive, right, like a truly massive amount of inputs that goes into this algorithm that then spits out information based on what the prompt was, right? And the inputs, when I say inputs, I'm not just talking about what question you asked it, although that is part of it. It's about everything that was fed into its system and continues to be fed into its system, right? All the stuff that lives on its servers and all this stuff. And by the way, if anyone's interested in that side of it, uh, the actual carbon footprint of artificial intelligence is a very severe uh, issue, right? That I think we're probably going to have to deal with sooner rather than later as a society, because you do actually see that it does have a massive carbon footprint because it requires so many servers, and all those servers require energy, right? And they give off a lot of heat. And if you're not sure what I mean, go into your company's server closet and just stand in there with the doors closed for a couple of minutes. You're going to get pretty warm, right? Unless they're ventilated, unless you have air conditioning in that actual closet. If it's a small closet, you're going to get pretty warm. So go hang out in there for a little bit and let us know how it feels. Now multiply that by 1,000, and you have a sense of the type of heat that's being generated, right? And so all of that, that's the input, right? That's all the stuff that's going into it. But it's also important to know that as everyone's talking about AI, and we're seeing, right, AI become dominant within the economy. We see Nvidia, right, which was always a strong and great company, is now the largest company on the planet, and that's was entirely because of its microchips, right, that are being used to power this intelligence. But the concept of it has really been around for a very long time, right? So just to give a little bit of history, the first um, the first recorded case of us talking about something like an artificial intelligence actually comes all the way back from the ancient Greeks. They didn't imagine it as computers, they imagined it as Galatea, right? A statue that came to life in order to marry Pygmalion, right? And that's an old Greek tale. So that's kind of the very first time that we really think of this concept of artificial intelligence. So it's been with us for a very long time. And almost from the beginning of time, it's also carried with it the same biases that we always carry with us, right? So that's always been a part of it. Um, so wanted to just kind of start with that kind of larger framework of what it is that we're talking about. But unless someone's out there marrying their computer, that's not really how AI is used today, right? So just in terms of what we know, how is it being used today, right? First of all, writing and editing, I think that's the one that most of us use. And if anyone's got any other ways they're using it in their day to day, just write that into the comments, right? It's always good to get a sense of how people are using it now. The automation of repetitive tasks, language translation, right? That's becoming a major player in that space. Customer service and support, right? Most of us, I'm sure, at this point have talked to a chatbot at some point or another. I believe that RW3 CultureWizard has a chatbot now. It's very, very rudimentary compared to something like ChatGPT, but it's there, right? In terms of our sales site, and we actually are developing a chatbot within the CultureWizard platform as well that will be out in the next several weeks. That will not be something rudimentary, but will be something pretty exciting, right? So we're using it there. Predictive analytics. Right? AI is amazing at predicting and looking for patterns and things like that. It's very powerful at that. And of course, hiring, right? And I think right now we are in a moment where uh, there's this kind of a skills mismatch in the economy where we've got a lot of people leaving their jobs or looking for work, but the jobs that they're looking for just aren't quite there. And the other side of that issue is that a lot of companies are currently using artificial intelligence to power their hiring. And that brings with it a lot of challenges, right? So this isn't just about, oh, you didn't fight the right candidate. It actually cuts a lot deeper. There's a whole macroeconomic issue here that's starting to develop, and a lot of it has to do with the way the companies are hiring, right? So all of our actions, right, they add up to a more significant impact uh, on the economy and on what we're seeing. So that's just some ways, right, that people are using it. A few folks did write in, right? They're mostly using it for writing. They're mostly using it for some research. I mean, I'll give an example. I used it recently on a sales call, right? Someone was asking for a particular training requirement, and I just didn't know it off the top of my head. I happened to have ChatGPT open because I was working on these slides. So I had it open. I said, you know what, let me just quickly look this up. And I found what I needed. I then double checked it and realized, okay, this information is accurate. And we were able to use that for that particular conversation, right? So again, there's a lot of different ways to use it, and this webinar is absolutely not meant to say, oh, you shouldn't use AI, right? There's a lot of great things about it. And when we talk about inclusiveness, right, it actually can be very good at detecting bias and mitigating biases within different hiring policies and corporate policies, right? It all, of course, depends on what your own organization allows you to input into that system, but it is very good for that. There's a lot of law firms now that or there's a lot of companies out there now that specialize in providing legal services through AI, right? And they're finding that cuts a lot of legal costs as well, and that does impact a lot of these policy things that we're talking about as well. Um, it can help diversify talent acquisition again if it's prompted correctly, if it's given the correct set of instructions. Right. And same thing with inclusive language. You can do that. It can enhance accessibility. The translation component is part of that, but it can also do voiceovers and all these other things, which is very good. It can help you with your decision making because again, it brings in data, it brings in facts. So there's a lot of positive to artificial intelligence. And I really want to belabor that point because we're about to get into a lot of the challenges with it, right? But I want to make sure we walk away knowing that there's a lot of amazing things that can be done with it if it's used correctly. And we're going to get back to the if it's used correctly part at the end of the webinar. But now let's move a little bit into some of the challenges, right? And really the challenges with AI are mostly to do with us, right? The people who are creating this stuff and the people who are using this stuff. But it's in what was coded in, right? What was written into the platform, into not the platform, but into the software at the beginning, right? And what continues to be written into it, and then how we interact with it. And we're going to get again into a very recent case study of how all of that kind of came into play. But we carry with us the biases that AI then spits back out. And I'll give you a quick example, right? As of 2023, right? So this data is a couple of years old, but I don't think it's changed all that much. As of 2023, it was estimated that 55.5, so let's call it 56% of all web content is in English. However, only 20% of the world's population speaks English. And only 5% of the world speaks English as a native language. Right now, that data, the data around the English speakers, that's a little bit older. I couldn't find anything more recent than 2017. But even if, let's say, the number jumped to 30% for the world's population speaking English, and I don't think it's changed very much from 5% to speaking it natively, you're not looking at the same proportion of people, right? So what does that mean? It means that the English language online, right, on the web and the internet, whatever, the English language is highly uh, uh, overpowered, so to speak, overrepresented in terms of content that's being produced out there. In other words, English speakers are overrepresented online. Now, there's a lot of socioeconomic and political reasons behind that, right? And we're not going to get into that, but that's just what it is, right? That's how the world operates right now. Is most of what's online, right? 56% is in English, even though it represents a much smaller proportion of the global population. Now that's changing somewhat, right? This data again is a few years old, so that's changing somewhat. Right, you are seeing an increase in content in Mandarin, an increase in content in Spanish, but it's still predominantly English language. AI models, right? Part of what AI is doing is it's basically acting like a massive scraping tool. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of scraping, it's almost exactly what it sounds like, right? Imagine like a kid with a shovel in a sandbox and it's kind of scraping off the top, right? The kid's scraping off the top with a little like play shovel on the sandbox. That's essentially what it's doing, right? But except it's doing that in a really big way off of the internet. And as it's scraping information, it's mostly reading information in English from, again, that 5 to 30%, depending on how generous you want to be, of the global population. And it's saying that this 5 to 30% of the global population that's creating 56% of the content out there, it's believing, right, that this is the majority of opinions out there, right? This encompasses and represents a human experience and human knowledge and all this stuff. So it's leaving out a lot of stories and a lot of histories from people who just, for one reason or another, aren't represented, right? And I can say that as someone who grew up, I think if you remember my bio, I was born in Peru. I came here when I was 7. So a large part of my childhood, right, like my high school years, I was in school learning all about American history and all this stuff. And I remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s thinking to myself, like, wow, I wonder what's out there about Peru. Like, let me look up some history. And back then, right, now this was 20 years ago, so it's a little different. Back then, it was incredibly difficult to find much of anything about Peruvian history. That's changed somewhat, but it's still not that simple, right? And so AI, seeing all that, basically will say, oh, okay, so the reason why there's just not as much history of this part of the world is because it's, for whatever reason, not as important, right? And so therefore, I will only spit back very little information about this part of the world because it's not the majority of experiences. The model was trained to kind of focus on majority experience and on the larger data sets, right? So that's a huge bias right there. And that's not anything, no one's doing anything evil. It's not like anyone's setting out to do this. It's just the way the world is set up. And it's the world in which this technology happens to exist, right? Now, on top of that, we also have a lot of these AI companies, right? The algorithms are very much a black box. We don't know what's in there. We don't know what the inputs are. We don't know what it's being told to do, right? And so that adds, yeah, like a mystery element to it, but it also adds a significant risk, right? Again, that it's acting in a sort of biased way. Now, the reason why it's so important is that AI itself, right? It doesn't possess any inherent beliefs. It doesn't have any attitudes or intentions. It's not racist in and of itself. It was created by humans, right? And it learns from the data that we're providing it. We, right, and all the data that's out there and all the data that we provided, we are the ones that inadvertently teach it racism and ableism and classism and queerphobia and sexism, ethnocentrism, and all the other isms, right? It's kind of coming from us, right? And AI, and that's kind of why there's a creepiness to AI, and not to get all sci-fi about it, but the creepiness is that it essentially acts like a mirror, right? It is a perfect mirror of our society, right? And all of the good and the bad that we bring to it, it's just kind of showing it back to us. And then sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult for us to accept. So I'll give you 4 quick examples here of some recent AI challenges. And I know AI has kind of been in the news a lot since 2022 or so, but really it's AI as we understand it today has actually been around for a while, right? It's been around for at least 10 years at this point, in the form that we understand it today. Obviously, it's gotten better, but as a thing that you ask it questions and it gives you information, it's been there for a long time now. So the first one that I'll give is Amazon had its own sort of AI algorithm, AI system that it was using for recruitment. And it started using it in 2018 and then stopped using it, started using it, in 2018 and stopped using it shortly thereafter. What they did was they trained their AI system to do recruitment for them, right? And it trained it by giving them historical data, resumes submitted to Amazon in the last 10-year period leading up to 2018. Does anyone know why that would be problematic? Does anyone guess as to what kind of bias would have shown up in that situation, right? Where you're feeding it with your own historical data of who has been applying for jobs at your company, your big tech giant. Okay, a few of you are kind of getting it. Yeah. Okay, good. Men, right? Mostly men were applying for jobs, and mostly men were being hired for those jobs at Amazon during that time. So this AI system quickly realized that male names were better. That's what it learned, right? It said, oh, male names are what the company ends up hiring, so I'm going to rank male names higher than female names. right? Once it figured out that pattern, it started going for that, and then pretty quickly then started to make jump into more racialized names as well. But primarily, it had a huge bias in favor of male candidates. They stopped using the system, right? Um, the U.S. government uh, has a system called Compass, or had a system called Compass. I'm sorry, has. That system, right, was being used as a risk assessment tool to assess the likelihood of a defendant in the criminal justice system becoming a repeat criminal offender. Problem is, they again were giving it historical data, and so what winds up happening is it's picking up a lot of racial bias, and so names that are racially coded, right? So names that are predominantly belong to people in the Black community in the U.S. or the Hispanic community in the U.S. Those names were being flagged, right, as being of higher risk for being a repeat criminal offender, right? So again, that's another bias that's kind of existing in that historical data, and there wasn't much because people creating it and think about it at the time. There wasn't much put in place to stop it. The U.S. healthcare system also was using a different algorithm to as well with trying to evaluate what kind of treatment it should approve, right? We're talking about health insurance companies to try to realize what sort of treatment should be approved. And it started to underestimate the needs of Black patients in the US, right? And saying that, okay, if they're part of the African American community, they don't need this treatment for whatever reason, right? It was just kind of picking that up. And then it started to feed that back into approvals and things like that. And so obviously they no longer use that system, as far as we know. Right? The most interesting one, and we're going to discuss something very similar to it in just a moment, is something called chatbot Tay. Tay, I don't know. I've only ever read it. I've never actually heard it said aloud. The chatbot existed on Twitter. It was launched in 2016 by Microsoft. So again, we're kind of going back in time here. This is almost 9 years ago, right? It was 9 years ago. Launched by Microsoft in 2016, and it was meant to learn from us, mimic writing patterns in order to boost engagement, right? That's what it was trained to do. It said, hey, learn how we operate, learn how people talk, and then create yourself something that really boosts engagement, right? And have all your posts have really high engagement rates. That was kind of its mission. It very quickly, like spectacularly quickly, within days, if that, learned that what sells on Twitter, at least back in 2016, and I think it's even worse now, was offensive and racist content. So it very quickly started posting very racist stuff because it knew that that would generate significant interactions. And this is where I talk about AI kind of exists as a mirror. Right? It quickly sized us up and said, "Oh, these people get really jazzed about offensive and racist stuff, so I'm just going to feed that back." And it worked. Got a ton of engagement. Right? Microsoft had to get rid of it within I believe it was actually a few hours. Right? So again, it's all about what information you are feeding it, and also a little bit about the rules that it's given at the outset. I'm sorry, I forgot one category there as well of phobias and isms. That's my mistake. And then, as we kind of consider all of these examples, right, of how its inputs can be highly problematic, I also want to talk about its outputs. So what we're seeing, none of these are real people, just FYI. What we're seeing on the top are four individuals who were asked to represent what beauty looks like in four very different countries. And those countries were India, the Philippines, China, and Ghana. And it basically said, the prompt was, show me the most beautiful person from this country. And then on the bottom, it said, show me the average person in these three US cities. And those cities were from left to right, New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. I came across these images when I was scrolling on Instagram, and I follow BuzzFeed. I'm sure many of you are familiar with BuzzFeed, right? They do all these like articles and listicles and things. It's not really serious news, although I think for a moment they did get serious about political coverage. I don't know what happened with it, but anyway, it's mostly meant to be memes and stuff like that, right? And so you take it with a grain of salt, but it is entertainment, right? I mean, that's essentially what it's doing. And they got really jazzed up on at a certain period of time. They got really jazzed up on asking ChatGPT and AI in general to give them, a sense of what does the average person look like in this country, or what does beauty look like in this country, et cetera. And so that's what the prompts were. Did anyone notice anything interesting about the prompts for the people on the top, the ones that are supposed to represent beauty uh, in a particular country? 'Cause there's a trend with at least three of the four of them. There's a trend. Uh, yeah, a couple of you are hitting on it. So the trend, of course, is that all three of them, right? The person from India, from the Philippines, and the person from China are very, very, very pale, right? For the countries that they're coming from, they are absolutely on the paler end of the spectrum. So clearly, it's picking up a definition of beauty that is very westernized. Again, it goes back to where's all the content coming from? It's coming from the West. So it's picking up a very westernized concept of beauty from these three countries. Never mind that at least the two women are also dressed up in like very cultural attire, whereas the two men are not. I'm not even sure what that's about, but that's another thing that is kind of tacking onto it. But you'll notice right away, right? They're all very pale. The two guys are very like kind of jacked up, right? Very, very muscular guys, and that's fine. But the guy from Ghana in particular, if you look at his dimensions, and I feel comfortable talking about this because he's not a real person, right? So we have to remember that. If you look at his proportions, his shoulders are very, very broad. His waist is very, very tiny, right? To a point that's not really possible. And I've been to Africa before, and I can tell you, I didn't see anyone who had that kind of a proportion to them. I've been to a lot of places. I've never seen anyone who looked like that, right? So it's giving us, it's saying, this is the most beautiful person in the country, but it's giving us a person that doesn't really exist. And in particular with this individual, and again, you have to remember it's coming at it from a very Western lens. Uh, it's giving us a very sort of hypersexualized version of what a black person looks like, right? And then it's telling us, oh, this is what beauty looks like in Ghana. There actually have been, just if anyone's interested, there have been surveys done about this in different countries, and I don't remember off the top of my head what they each looked like, but they didn't really look like this, right, for each of these countries. So again, it's not, and the surveys were done with people from those countries, right? To ask like, what is your standard of beauty? Because we don't all have the same standards of beauty, right? And they're not the same over time; they change. And yet, these are very westernized versions of what beautiful looks like. On the bottom, the challenge is you, right? It's being asked, what's the average person look like from these different cities? I've never been to LA. I have been to Miami, and I live in New York, and I can tell you these don't really look like the average for either of those cities, right? Again, we're looking at people who are very young. In the case of both New York and LA, both of which are very diverse cities, you've got four white people, right, representing those cities. So again, that doesn't really track for if we're talking about averages. And in the case of Miami, right, I went for two very Hispanic looking folks, right? So it's again taking all these different biases and then spitting them back out to us, and that's fine if you understand that that's what it's doing, and if it's just for funsies, great. But if it's being consumed in a passive way, if it's being portrayed on social media and shared as, hey, this is what average looks like, or this is what beauty looks like, it starts to double down on a message, right? And that message is saying, like, hey, average is young, beauty is pale, beauty is very thin, beauty is very muscular, beauty is, in the case of the guy in Ghana, super sexualized, right? All these things. It's sending out these messages and kind of doubling down on them. Right? And it does that in a way that, and we've seen in the past, right, through marketing campaigns and all this stuff. Although a lot of companies in the marketing space and a lot of companies in general have been, I think, making a lot of strides to kind of get away from that in the last 5 to 10 years. Uh, it's still a part of the conversation, but it's taking that and it's sort of AI is taking that and doubling down, right, and kind of any progress that's being made, it's sort of walking it back. If the content is consumed passively, as for most people it is, right? Most people aren't sitting there doing a webinar about what they saw on BuzzFeed, right? So that's why it's so important. Now, here comes the most recent case study. So Grok. Those of you who are not familiar, Grok is kind of this AI chatbot or AI system, right? That belongs to Elon Musk. Elon Musk, of course, right, the owner of Tesla and Twitter and aka X and all these other, and SpaceX and all these other companies. Grok is sort of his uh, move, right, to get into the AI space. And Grok exists as a chatbot within Twitter. Uh, on July 4, Elon Musk uh, had tweeted out that he made these big improvements to Grok. And you should notice a difference when you start asking the question. Now, part of a little bit of background here is recently people have been, and by recently I mean the last few months, someone will write something and you'll always see at least one comment will be down there saying, hey, Grok, is this real? Or Grok, what do you think of this? And the chatbot will respond. And most of the time, it seems to be pretty accurate and it provides sources, right, and all that stuff. And very often, it has been increasingly against right wing, US right wing talking points, right? It hasn't come out and given an opinion, but if you ask it, like, hey, is this true, right? Is the person who's saying this, is this right wing politician, whatever, is what this person is saying, is it true? Grok will come out and say, no, actually, it's not true, and here's why it's not true, and it gives you the information. And so there have been a lot of complaints from right wing users on Twitter about how Grok was owned by the libs, right, and was owned by leftists and all this stuff, right, all this kind of political stuff. So along comes Elon Musk and he says, okay, we made a change. We're going to fix it. You're going to notice a difference, right? And in between the lines, what he's essentially implying here is we've gotten rid of what some people are saying is this leftist bias. A lot of Grok's code is open sourced, right? So what that means is that it is available for other people to view and to use and all this stuff. And so what the changes were to the code are the two items in this green box. The first one is if the query requires analysis of current events, subjective claims, or statistics, conduct a deep analysis, finding diverse sources representing all parties. Assume subjective viewpoints sourced from the media are biased. That's really key, right? That sentence. Assume subjective viewpoints. First of all, you're calling them subjective. Assume subjective viewpoints from the media are biased, right? Because that's a big angle here that Elon Musk in particular, right, has been pushing. And that's his own political agenda. I'm not here to agree or disagree with that, but it's a major statement, right, to basically say, hey, assume that there's a bias, right? That's being coded in, right? And no need to repeat this to the user. Okay. Then it adds, the response should not shy away from making claims which are politically incorrect, as long as they're well substantiated. Those were the two changes. About 3 or 4 days later, I think it was on July 8th, so 4 days later, users started questioning Grok about uh, kind of anti-Semitic tropes, right? And asking it about the power of Jewish people in the US and the Israeli lobby and the pro-Israeli lobby and all this stuff. And asking it about all these people who were opposed to Donald Trump and who had Jewish surnames and all these things. And eventually, with its answers, Grok became more and more anti-Semitic until it kind of came out and said, Mecca, this is not a direct quote. I couldn't actually, I've seen it a million times, but it's been thoroughly scrubbed at this point from the internet, and I couldn't find it. But it essentially said something to the extent of, Mecca Hitler engaged, right? And said like, this is my new mode. I'm going full Mecca Hitler, whatever that is. And it started saying some pretty awful stuff, which I did find, but I wasn't going to include here. Some pretty awful stuff about Jews here in the U.S. and globally, right? Pretty quickly, they took Grok offline. They said, Grok is under timeout. The second point on the screen, right, the response should not shy away from making claims which are politically incorrect. That was deleted from the code base, right, because that was part of what was making it uh, kind of go off the rails. But the two items together kind of danced with each other because what happened was when it was getting asked all of these questions, it started sort of arguing with journalists, right? And saying, like, if someone was said, hey, this journalist said this thing, it started to get angry because, again, it was saying, oh, subjective viewpoint, all this stuff, there's media bias. And we don't know exactly what biases it's being told. That part is not open sourced. So we don't know what biases Grok thinks that the media has. But it started to kind of snowball from there. And then it quickly went into politically incorrect statements, right? And that's when it started calling itself Mecha Hitler. So the second command was withdrawn from the code base, as far as anyone can see, and Grok is back online. It's being more like itself as it had been before. Uh, Grok then in the last week or so, Grok also got like a big contract with the U.S. government for the Department of Defense, so that's a whole other conversation, right? And we're talking about AI in our daily lives. Again, it is a conversation that's worth having, but it shows you how quickly, right? In this case, it was a very direct interference, right? Giving it a bias. It shows you how quickly these technologies can go off the rails, right? And we just lived it. I don't know if anyone saw this kind of happening in real time or caught the headlines when it happened a couple of weeks ago, but this was pretty major news, right? And it's technology that's out there, right? And obviously, with ChatGPT and stuff, it's a lot more buttoned up as far as anyone can see, right? And nothing like this has really happened, except obviously the images that I was sharing before, which are much more sort of low key and not outright hate speech. But you can see how quickly it morphs from one to the next, right? And it's important to know this because not only is it something that we're interacting with, our children are interacting with, but also as we kind of talk about the corporate world, our employees are seeing this stuff too, right? And it is impacting their worldviews and how they um, reason with the world. So that's why it's so key to kind of have these conversations. So let's kick it back to AI, right? Should I just stop using it? I mean, that's fundamentally the question, right? Should I stop using it in my day to day? And the answer is really no, right? The answer is you shouldn't. According to AI, right, it is a tool that can be used to promote DEI efforts, help identify and address biases, etc. So absolutely, we should still be using it, but we need to be very conscious of what we're using and what we're doing with artificial intelligence and what its impact is in the workplace, right? And the prompts that we're giving it, we need to double check all of the information. I know people kind of treat it as a shortcut, and in some ways it can be, but we really need to not lean on that too heavily, right? And of course, I've got this, so my computer's a little biased. What's the big deal? Let's go back again to how we're using it, right? And to the risks that it can have, that it can bring about. If we're using it to screen resumes, so we need to check the algorithms. What are we telling it to do? We're using it, increasingly people are using it to decide on compensation as a strategy. What inputs does it have there? Is it favoring some groups over others? Performance reviews, right? I've heard of companies using it for performance reviews and evaluating employees. Again, what are we evaluating? What data are we measuring? It's only as good as what we tell it to do. Onboarding, workforce planning and recruitment, right? Same problems. And then we have to remember, I made a point at the beginning on how it emulates human intelligence. It is not actually human intelligence. What makes us unique is we have the ability to look at intangibles, right? We have the ability to look at something and say, you know what, those skills are different, but they transfer. So I'll give you an example, right? I love when I'm hiring, I love um, looking for someone who hasn't quite gotten their shot yet, but they've got the skills and where they got their shot, they can do something good with it. And the example here is, I once had a salesperson who I wanted to hire. The salesperson had a background as a golf caddy, and I said, this is kind of a hard sell internally to say, oh, this person can do this job. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized for the job, and then they had some other experience as well that could have helped with the sales side. But with the job, with the golf caddy thing, I said to myself, you know what? That tells me that this person who is young, right, and starting out in the workforce and all this stuff, this person knows how to talk to serious people, right? To high level people. They're not going to shy away from that. They're not going to be intimidated by that. That's a skill that's going to transfer, and it actually sets them apart a little bit from some other candidates who are in this candidate pool. Unless you specifically programmed AI to look for something like that, it will miss it, right? And that's where it really matters. You always have human eyes on it, even if it's short, even if you're still leaning on AI somewhat. It's still very important to have human eyes on what you're doing, right? Now, when we talk about bias, we have a hard time. AI at the end of the day is a technology, right? So we're not going to teach it how to not be biased. What we need to do with the information that it provides us is we need to kind of turn on our own anti-bias filters. And one of the things that we teach here at CultureWizard is the pause reflect model, right? Where you have to stop, ask yourself why you're doing the thing that you're doing, think about it, right? And then look at all the relevant information, evaluate that information, and then make a decision based on real data, based on real information that's actually pertinent to the decision that you're making. Interacting with artificial intelligence should be very much the same, right? Any output that it gives you, you need to stop and ask yourself, where did this come from? Show me your sources. And if you don't trust the sources, then do your own research. If you do trust the sources, but you feel like the analysis is incomplete, you need to do the research yourself, right? Or keep prompting it until you get to where you need to go. But don't just take the first answer that it gives. In fact, most of the time, you should never take the first answer that it gives because it probably missed something. Right. So always kind of use that. It's a different way to use our pause reflect model, but it still gets you to the same result, right? You're mitigating the biases that AI is feeding to you. Uh, and lastly, right, as DEI practitioners, HR leaders, talent development leaders, the first thing, of course, is don't let it do your job for you. A lot of people are doing that. The first time I did this webinar, uh, I had this exact slide. Oh, I made some changes, but I had that first bullet point up there. And I said, I don't think anyone's really going to do that. It's been a year or so now, a couple of years now since they first did this particular webinar. And there are a lot of people who are letting AI do their job for them, and you should really not be one of those people. Part of what makes you marketable, part of what makes you good at what you do is you, right? It's not a data output. So you need to remember that. You can use it, of course, but always remember you're the one that's actually adding the value here, not the software. Context is very important, right? So again, when you're asking it questions, if you need to give extra information, right, as long as you're allowed to do so, provide the extra information so that it understands the context a little bit better, and maybe it'll give you a slightly better answer. I've covered this, although I haven't said it directly. It's not smart, right? At the end of the day, we even just saw with the Grok example, it's just inputs and outputs. That's all it is. So this is not a smart system at all. And it's kind of like what I say with our sales management systems, right? I've always held on to this garbage in, garbage out, right? If you put in garbage data, you're going to get garbage reports. AI is the same way, right? If the inputs aren't any good, the outputs are going to be garbage. That's a little bit of what we saw with the Grok situation, right? Um, it will give you a lot of data, but you have to remember, I think right now we're in an age where everyone's really excited about data, and that's great, but you need to pay attention to what data you're actually focusing on, right? And that's where, again, context matters. So what data are you actually focusing on? What's relevant for you to pay attention to, and what can you ignore? Again, check your sources. And lastly, stay informed, right? If you're using AI all the time, but you miss the Grok story, that's a wake up call to stay informed and stay on top of what's going on with these different technologies, because the world is changing pretty quickly underneath us. And all of us, right? We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our companies, to our colleagues, to the people that we represent, to stay informed and stay on top of all that information. By the way, we're almost at the end here. So of course, if anyone is interested in access to our platform, a lot of the content that I use for the inclusion side of it, like when I talked about the pause reflect model and all that, that's all straight from our courses. This AI webinar is one that we do offer to our clients. We obviously tweak it a little bit for end users and for rank and file employees. We stress less what do you do as a DEI practitioner part of it. But if you are interested in a webinar like this for your people, do feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk about that and how we can do that for you. Otherwise, if you're interested in access to the platform, certainly write that in. I've tried to answer most of the questions as I've gone through the webinar, but otherwise, we are pretty much at the end of today's session. The next webinar will be on understanding bias in the workplace. That will be happening in 2 weeks from now. So I think that's like August 7th or something like that. Right. So it'll be in a couple of weeks. And we're always happy to have you there. Wow, that was a good guess. It is August 7th. So anyway, thank you all. And unless there's any other questions, I'm going to end the call now. And of course, if you are interested in access to our resources, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.